Okay, everybody. Dare I say we've saved the best for last. This is Dr. David Thorstad, who did his PhD at Harvard, is now doing his postdoc at the Global Priorities Institute, and is a philosopher who specialized in bounded cognition, but is going to talk to us today about the awesome topic of genuinely consider that I think the world might actually end. So excited.
All right, everyone can hear me okay? Sounds like I'm mic'd up. All right, you don't need the first slide. So there are two things that people often say, and in particular effective altruists often say about existential risk. The first is what I call the astronomical value claim. Not only is it valuable to do what we can to mitigate existential risk, it's astronomically valuable to do what we can to mitigate existential risk. And the sketch argument is something like this: well, the future is an expectation astronomically good. A small additional chance of an astronomical value you multiply through is still worth astronomically much, and that's why you'd believe this. The other thing you hear a lot is pessimism about current levels of existential risk, by which I mean just that levels of risk are fairly high. So Toby Ord most famously puts it at 1 in 6, or as he calls it, Russian roulette, that we have an existential catastrophe by 2100. Lord Martin Rees, who you've heard today, puts it at 50-50 for civilizational collapse, again by 2100. And the first time we ever polled a conference room full of people at Oxford was 2008. They said not only in the mean, but actually the straight up median was 19%, only looking at existential extinction level events. So I'll ballpark the pessimist at about 20%, but if you want to rerun this talk with 15%, it's not going to be that much different. It's really natural to think that pessimism supports the astronomical value thesis, right? The higher a risk is, the more important it is to drive that risk down. If I know anything about risk, that's true. Claim of the talk is not true. It's not even close to true. So the claim of the talk is, with very few exceptions across models, the more pessimistic you are about levels of existential risk, the less important, not the more important, you should think it is to mitigate them. And this can be so strong that you can lose astronomical value just based on pessimism alone. So we're going to look at that across models, and then we'll say, okay, if you wanted both of these theses together, how would you get them together? And there's a standard way to do it, is the time of perils. You say, well, I'm pessimistic about this century, pessimistic about the next century, but if we make it through these centuries, then you switch to being an optimist and you have low levels of risk thereafter. And then the claim of the rest of the talk is, I'm not sure we should believe the time of perils hypothesis. So this is a pretty long paper. I'll try to walk through at least the first 2 points, and we'll see how far we get into the third. Credit where credit's due. Toby Ord did a lot of the modeling here. Tom Adamszewski, who does not like me giving him credit, but Tom Adamszewski also did a lot of the modeling here, and I'm just picking up some models in this tradition. Right, so let's just start with a really simple model of the world to see what the problem could be. Now, of course, all models are false. This model is a little falser than most, so we're going to ask throughout the rest of the talk, how would you have to change this model to get a different conclusion? But first, let's start with a pretty simple model. So we're going to assume first that two things are constant. First, the value of a century of human existence. So it's 0, of course, if we perish. Until that, I'll assume it's a constant value. If it's worth some value v this century, the next century, as long as we reach it, is worth v, all the way forward. And I'm going to make the same value assumption about existential risk. So let it be some level r, like 20% this century, then it's also r 20% the next century, r, and you have no change in value, no change in risk. And the final assumption I'm going to make is that all existential risks are risks of extinction. And this just lets us assume that you get zero value after an existential catastrophe, and you don't have to play around with other scenarios. So these are simplifying assumptions, and we'll remove them later, but what happens on this model? Well, first let's look at just the question of how good the world is right now in expectation. If you have these assumptions, well, the world is worth v this century, v the next, v, you add it up, you get infinity. Except not quite, because you have probability r of missing the first v, so 1 minus r of getting it. 1 minus r squared of getting the next v, 1 minus r cubed of getting the next v, so on and so forth, and that's a geometrical series, you know how to sum it up. But the question we're interested in is not really what's the value of the world, although that's a good guide. The question is, how good would it be in this world to reduce existential risk? So let's ask, for most of this talk, a pretty targeted question, namely, assume that you can reduce risk by some fraction f of its current amount in this century, but other centuries have to fend for themselves. You can't, as it were, reach out over all time and reduce risk right now. Maybe think f is like a 10% reduction, so you're chopping risk from r to, 0.9r. And the question is, how good would that be on the simple model? And it turns out the value of reducing risk by f on the simple model is pretty simple. It's, well, the value of a century v scaled by the fraction f by which you chopped off risk. So if you chop risk by 10%, that's about a tenth as good, exactly a tenth as good as the current century. Looks simple. This is actually really surprising for two reasons. So the first is that pessimism, optimism about risk just doesn't show up here, right? The level of background risk r, 20% or 5% or a thousandth of a percent, literally makes no difference to this expression. We thought it would drive up this expression, but just doesn't show up. And partly because of that, you're not getting astronomical values here, right? The value of reducing risk by a complete 100% in your own century is the value of a single century of human existence. Absolutely nothing to sneeze about, can be worth doing, but you're not getting a trillion or a quadrillion times the value of the current century. And so the question is, this isn't the picture that we wanted. We've got an astronomical value for mitigating risk. What would we have to change about this model to get an astronomical value without, as it were, completely abandoning pessimism about risk? So I don't think I did absolute risk here. Yeah, I do. I have absolute risk in the paper. It's the same story. It's just a rescaling. So remember, I assumed every century is worth the same. This century is worth v. Next century is worth v, 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 v. As long as you get there, that's bonkers. Why is that crazy? Well, if you do get to future centuries, they could be bad, but in expectation, they're probably going to be more people. They're probably going to have happier and longer and healthier lives. So you really do want to be letting the value of future centuries increase. And so the question is this going to help increase the value of risk reduction? Well, of course, it's going to increase it somewhat, but the question is, how much is value growth going to increase the value of risk reduction? So Toby Ord and Tom Edashevsky look at a linear value growth model. Instead of centuries being worth v, 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 it's v, and then 2v, 3v, 4v, 5v, and so on. They don't look at anything stronger. Here I look at quadratic growth, and I do cubic growth in an appendix if you care. So v, 4v, 9v, 16v. And the question is, if you have the world valued in this way, what happens to the value of mitigating existential risk? And roughly, you're just dividing through by more and more r's. So remember, on the simple model, if you chop some fraction f, like 10% off of risk, that's worth 10% of the value of a century. When you have linear value growth, you're dividing through by the background level of risk r. Remember, this is a good thing, not a bad thing, because risk is decimal. But if you're a pessimist, it's a pretty big decimal, right? If risk is 20%, you're dividing by 0.2, and you're only kicking the value of risk mitigation up by 5, and now you start to see the problem. Quadratic value growth, this 2 minus r thing is strictly between 1 and 2. It's not going to make a qualitative difference. You're dividing through by r squared, background level of risk. Again, that's a good thing. But if r is, say, 0.2, then r squared is 1 over 25, and you've only kicked up by a factor of 25. So now we start to see the driving problem of the paper, namely that being a pessimist about where risk is not only not helping us to get astronomical values for reducing risk, it's standing in the way. That we're dividing by this thing that if you're a pessimist isn't going to give you that much punch, and if you're an optimist really would have given you a lot of punch. So for an example, if you're 100 times as pessimistic about risk as I am, and I think many effective altruists might be, on a quadratic growth model, you should be 10,000 times less enthusiastic about risk reduction than I am. And if you pack in other assumptions, it could be worse. So it looks like pessimism is the problem, and it's so much of a problem that it's really hard to get astronomical value out of these growth models, even if, unless you abandon pessimism. So I think I've just done through quadratic growth. So yeah, the question again we're going to ask is, how good is it in this century to chop a fraction f, say 10%, off of risk? And I've graphed this, I guess, across a spectrum on the top from pessimism, risk is at 20% per century before you reduce it, all the way to optimism, so 2% per century, 0.2% per century, 0.02% per century. And then down the rows, I've looked at modes of value growth. So the simple model had no growth in the value of centuries, but you can also have linear growth or quadratic growth, or you could do cubic growth if you really want. So what happens here? Of course, as you move down, as you pack on more and more growth assumptions, you do get an inflation in the value of risk reduction. So, you know, in the pessimist case, you get a 45 times multiplication. But as you move right from pessimism to optimism, you get a much larger boost. And if you want to be getting astronomical values for risk reduction, what you can't do is be in the red column where the pessimist is. You need to start moving from pessimistic assumptions like 20% risk per century towards optimistic assumptions like 0.02% per century. Now, okay, I'm claiming pessimism is the problem. You might say not so fast. I snuck in some assumptions. And again, we can try waiving other assumptions in the Q&A if you want to waive other assumptions. So I asked a very limited question, right? How good would it be to reduce risk in your own century by some fraction f and let other centuries fend for themselves? And you say, David, that's not fair. Surely what I do has some effect on risk in future centuries. If I sign a major treaty or form a major international organization, that is going to maybe last for a couple of centuries, and that's going to drive down risk, you know, not across all time, but for a couple centuries at once. Now, it turns out if you just run these models with a risk reduction over 5 centuries or over 10 centuries or something limited like that, you don't really get a qualitative change in behavior. But then you say to me, David, what if I could do something right now that would reduce risk across all time for, you know, billions and billions of years at once? And I think the best thing to say here is I'm not sure how one would do that. But even more surprisingly, if you assume I can reach out my hand and take 10% or 50% or even 90% off of risk for the entire remaining course of human history, that's still not going to be enough to get the pessimist out of the problem, just because the risk is still going to be too high. So again, same question, how good would it be on the simple model to chop the fraction f off of risk, but now in all centuries at once? And you've got this familiar V over R term, right? So the more valuable a century V of human existence is, the better it is to reduce risk. Again, dividing by R, the more pessimistic you are, that's just dragging this down linearly. But now you have this f over 1 minus f scalar, and it does what you expect, right? If you chop f equals 0% off of risk, then this goes to 0. Good news, if you chop f equals 100% off of risk, this goes towards infinity, right? Because you're just getting v, 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 and you're never dying. But the bad news, as it were, is that it goes towards infinity quite slowly. So you should probably do some calculus to make the point, but you can make these points with a table. So first, at the risk of, I think, beating a dead horse, pessimism isn't helping, right? The value of risk reduction is still going down, the level of risk R, and when you pack in value growth, it's going to go down more. Pessimism is not helping our case here. And second, it's really hard to get astronomical values for risk reduction, even across all centuries at once, if you're pessimistic about where the risk is starting at. So here in this table, I've graphed again in familiar form. I think the values, oh right, I changed the graph a little bit. So across the top, we still have a spectrum from optimism to pessimism. On the left, we have, you know, a pessimistic view. We started at 20% risk per century, going all the way down to 2%, 0.2%, and 0.02%. And down the rows, we're saying, suppose you could reach out your hand and chop 10% or 50% or 90% off of risk, not only in your own century, but in all centuries to come. And you see, of course, that as you raise f, you get a little bit of benefit, right? So if you could really chop 90% off of risk in your own century, actually quite amazingly, that's only 45 times as good as the present century on a pessimistic model. Now, if you start moving right to become more optimistic about risk, you start getting really big payoffs. And when you combine this with something like value growth, you get quite astronomical payoffs. But this is starting to drive home the lesson that really, if you're in the red column, if you're a pessimist about risk, it's just very hard to to get astronomical value here. Okay, so there is, of course, a standard response, and I think this is the right response. What do you need to change in the model if you want pessimism now, but also an astronomical value to reducing risk? And the answer is you want to be pessimistic for the next couple of centuries, and then switch to being an optimist thereafter. So actually, funnily enough, it was Carl Sagan in popular science book, The Pale Blue Dot, who came up with this. You can read, I've linked the slides, I think, in the app and on the last slide as well. You can read the full quote here. I think this is actually a little bit metaphorical, so I'm just going to skip past Sagan and go to the math. So I didn't mean it that way. So the model, I'm just going to try to use the same notation I used before. So you've got some level of risk during the time of perils. Call it the perilous risk and call it R. Why R? Because we've been using R. And the time of perils is going to last for some number of centuries. Numbers are usually n, so just call it n. And that's going to contribute to the black portion of the value of the world. The value of the world is going to be exactly what the simple model said it was for the first n centuries. But then the time of perils hypothesis, we're going to get a change in the value of the world because risk is going to fall to a much lower level. Just call it RL for low R. And then, of course, the value of the world is going to shift to this red term, is exactly the same as before, except you've got a much lower level of risk. And what you know about geometric series is if you have a much level lower of risk, this series can be much stronger. And of course, we've got a probability weighting, right? You're dying during the time of perils with probability R, so surviving each century with probability 1 minus R, so you're going to make it through with probability 1 minus R to the n is where that term's coming from, but otherwise you're just looking at the value of the world pre and post peril. So this is going to help, and sorry, this is the only nasty equation. I've actually made it a little bit better. This is accurate to plus or minus the value of a single century. When we're looking at astronomical values, we can just chop off a v and not worry too much about this. So the value of chopping some fraction f off of risk is, let's actually read this right to left. So it's determined by the red value, the value of being in a safe world, namely what the simple model would have said the value of the world is if you dropped risk after the time of perils. So that's the world you're getting there, and you're taking a chancy gamble at increasing your chance of getting to the world. What's impacting your chance of getting to the world? Well, the amount f by which you reduced risk is actually just going linearly into this equation, so the more you chop off of risk in your own century, that's linearly increasing the value of reducing risk. Background risk R is a little complicated, so it looks like R is shooting up the value of risk reduction, but it's actually shooting it way down, right? Because this 1 minus R is getting raised to an exponent, so that's going to be the impact of R. And the length of the time of perils, the number of centuries we're in, is literally exponentially decreasing the value of reducing risk, right? The longer we're in danger, exponentially we're just less likely to survive the time of perils, so the value of reducing existential risk goes down exponentially. Right, sorry, that's the only messy equation here. But all you really need to know about this equation is if you want to make it small, you need to do two things. So first, you need to tell me the time of perils is going to end soon, right? The value of reducing risk is literally decaying exponentially in the length n of the time of perils. So if you got 20 or 30 or 50 centuries of danger, this is going to go very quickly, to the value of your intervention in the current century. And you also need that after the time of perils, things are going to get much better, right? If you're only dropping risk by like a factor of 10 or 20 or 30 after the time of perils, then you're just not going to get that much benefit to moving to a safer world. And so there's not that much benefit to a time of perils hypothesis. But if you do have both of these assumptions, so if you have a short time of perils n and a very low level RL of risk after the time of perils, then you can get an astronomical value for existential risk reduction, even if you're a pessimist about risk during the time of perils. So one last table, I promise. And the slides also, I promise I'll link the slides on my very last slide if someone wants to pull up slides, or there's a paper with a proper appendix. But so yeah, now I've graphed across the top something different, the length of the time of perils, 2 centuries or 5 centuries or 10 centuries, 20, 50 centuries. And down the sides, the level of risk during the time of, after the time of perils. So the most pessimistic case I'm going to consider is that risk falls to 1%, which for the pessimist would be actually a 20 times reduction. I'll also consider risk falling to 0.1% per century or even 0.01% per century, which would be a 2,000 times reduction in risk. And so as we saw, if we move to the right, if we get a very long, late 20 or 50 century time of perils, it doesn't matter what we're going to do, this value just cannot be large. And as we move up, if we have even like a 20 or a 200 times reduction in risk after the time of perils, we're not getting that much benefit here. But if we have a very, very sharp drop in risk after the time of perils, and this happens very quickly, then we can get a pretty large value, and when you plug in value growth or something, this goes quite large. So just summing up the modeling portion of the paper, we've been looking at the relationship between 2 claims. The first is the astronomical value thesis, that it's not only, well, of course it's valuable, it's astronomically valuable to do what we can to mitigate existential risk. And the second claim is a kind of pessimism, that risk, at least right now, is very high. And we saw first, as it were, the chilling shocker of the talk, that you would think high risk makes it more important to mitigate risk, but actually across models, even in the time perils model, high risk makes it less important, not more important to mitigate risk. And then we asked, okay, how could you square pessimism with astronomical value? We said, what did we look at? We looked at value growth won't work. I think I did risk reduction across all centuries in these slides. That won't work. I try a couple other things in the main paper. That won't work. If you want to square astronomical value and pessimism, you'd better go for the time of perils, right? You're pessimistic for a little while, and then you're optimistic thereafter. And so if that's right, one of the most important questions, I think, of our time would be whether or not only like a specific hinge of history hypothesis is true, but actually whether or not the time of perils hypothesis is true. And so the second half of this talk is going to argue that we shouldn't be so confident that the time of perils hypothesis is true. All right, we're about 25 minutes in, so we'll get through at least half of that. I don't want to push through too fast. So what's the thought here? Well, people like the time of perils hypothesis if you read Sagan or you read Ord, because they say technology puts us at risk, and our technology is getting very good very fast, and that's just multiplying risks quite quickly, which is plausible enough. But if you tell this kind of a story, you're going to explain why we're now at peril, but you're not yet going to have an explanation of why risk is going to go down in the future rather than up. So I've just stolen a chart from Our World in Data. Sorry, it's kind of hard to see, but here's what's happened to human technology. A couple million years ago, we oh man, I could barely read that. So we started using tools, and then we started using fire, and then very quickly we got agriculture and the wheel and irrigation and computers and semiconductors, and everything's happening faster and faster and faster. So if you have this story, you have, okay, risk is very high now because our technology is getting better, but you would think, based on this story, that risk is going to go nowhere but up in the future. So the thought is the time of perils hypothesis doesn't just have to tell me how we get from 20% risk to like 0.02% risk. It has to tell me how we shoot risk down that fast, despite technology, which drives risk going up in the future. And the thought is that's a pretty hard burden, so we need to look pretty carefully at the stories that would ground us in time of perils, and not say there's nothing to them, but suggest they might be a little bit too weak to push as hard as we want to push here. So in the paper, I look at 3. I've actually not talking about today probably the best argument by Leopold Aschenbrenner. Sorry, it's just too much math, and it would take too long, but it's in the talk, and his paper is on the GPI website. I would highly recommend. So I wanted to start with one way to get the time of perils is to think about space settlement. So Carl Sagan, who proposed the time of perils hypothesis, said as soon as he proposed it, here's why the time of perils hypothesis is true. Every civilization's got to become spacefaring, not because of exploratory or romantic zeal, right? It's not because it's fun, but for the most practical reason, staying alive, namely going out to space is what's going to keep us alive. And Elon Musk, when you ask him, Elon, why are you going to Mars? He says, I'm doing this to avoid existential risks. So he says, humanity is going to bifurcate along 2 dimensions. One path is we stay on Earth and then we die. And the alternative is we become a spacefaring civilization, and then we don't. So the thought here is that going to space is going to make us safer, roughly because there are more of us and we're more spread out. And as soon as we get to space, that's when peril is going to reduce quite a lot. So I don't like this story, and actually Toby Ord, I think, doesn't like this story for the same reason I don't. Uh-oh, it's fine. So there are 2 kinds of risks, and again, I'm just stealing this distinction from Toby Ord. There's anthropogenic risks, the ones we make ourselves, and there's natural risks, the ones we don't. So anthropogenic risks would be, human-made pandemics or artificial intelligence, and natural risks would be volcanoes or asteroids or natural pandemics. It's absolutely right to say that going to space is going to shoot down natural risk, right? If you think an asteroid or a supervolcano wiping out life on Earth is implausible, here's something that's really implausible. An asteroid hits Earth, and then an asteroid hits Mars, and then a supervolcano hits another planet, and this all happens in the same century. So fine, natural risk is really going to go down if we go to space, but that's not going to help at all, right? So if you look at Toby Ord's risk estimates, overall risk is 1 in 6, anthropogenic risk is 1 in 6, and natural risk is a rounding error, 1 in 10,000. So if the story about space is, you're going to shave off the natural risk, that's not the kind of reduction we need. So the question is, despite technology getting better, could we get a many thousand times drop in anthropogenic risk from going to space? And remember, could we do it fast, like in 10 or 20 centuries, not in 500 centuries? And here I think I'm a little bit doubtful. So I've just marked up Toby Ord's risk estimates a little bit. The green and the red box are mine. So here are Ord's figures, and I think they're somewhat reflective of many people's figures for different anthropogenic risks. There are some anthropogenic risks that going to space could help us with. It could help us with climate change. If we destroy this planet, we can always just find another. It could maybe help us with nuclear war. It's maybe easier to nuke one planet than to throw a nuke through space, fine. But again, that's not where most of the probability mass is here. So if you're just reducing these risks, that's not going to get you the kind of reduction you want. Where all the mass is on things like unaligned AI and engineered pandemics. And the question is going in the near term through space likely to drive these down by a factor of several thousand? And I think the thought is that it's pretty hard to see how this would happen. So you might imagine an unaligned artificial intelligence destroys all life on Earth, certainly knows how to get to Mars if we got to Mars, and then the thought is, okay, but this artificial intelligence can't figure out how to get to Mars and wipe out a couple of settlers on Mars. Not crazy to think there would be a problem here, but if you say it's 1 in 10,000 that artificial intelligence, after extinguishing all life on Earth, is stymied by some Martian colonists, I would want to hear a story here. Similarly with pandemics, if you've got a story where somebody successfully circulates a completely lethal sleeper virus and kills everybody on Earth before we know what they're doing, then you say, well, how do they manage to smuggle the virus onto Mars? It's a good question, but then you say, it's 1 in 100,000 they smuggle the virus onto Mars, and I think I'm a little bit doubtful here. So the thought here is that, of course, an appeal to space settlement is going to help, but it's just not clear that it's going to help enough to bring the time of perils to an end, at least quickly enough. I want to look at one more thing, and this is Toby Ord's favorite, is the appeal to wisdom. So, Carl Sagan actually came up with this, but I think Toby Ord puts the point pretty well. So he says, the problem we have right now isn't an excess of technology. It's not that our technology is shooting up. It's a lack of wisdom. So what did Carl Sagan say? Many of the dangers we face, they do arise from science and technology, that's the danger, but they more fundamentally arise because we're powerful without becoming wise. That we're like children, we have dangerous toys and we don't have the wisdom to use them. Carl Sagan was actually quite, I think, pithy and blunt here. He said, if we continue to accumulate only power and not wisdom, we'll surely destroy ourselves. So the thought is, what's going to bring the time of perils to an end? Well, no matter what happens to our technology, eventually we'll get wise enough to use the technology in safe ways and not dangerous ways, and that's going to drop risk quite a lot. So here I think you need to respond in two ways depending on how the story goes. So some ways of cashing out the wisdom story, they're quite detailed, they're reasonably plausible, but they're just going to be a little bit weak to do the job. So they're going to say, well, people are going to get a little bit wiser along some dimensions, and I'll say, fine, but how is that going to shave 4 orders of magnitude off of risk? Then there are some other stories, and we'll look at an example due to Toby Ord that maybe would be able to shave enough orders of magnitude off of risk. But precisely because these stories are very powerful, they might be less detailed or less plausible. So I want to look first at a plausible story, and I'm not actually sure if this was meant to be an appeal to wisdom, but it could at least be repurposed as an appeal to wisdom. So this is Nick Bostrom in Superintelligence claiming that at least he hopes humanity is going to become a little bit more sane over this century. So he says an optimist could expect the sanity level of humanity is going to rise, prejudices will, we hope, on balance recede, insight will accumulate, people will become more accustomed to thinking about abstract future probabilities and risks, fair enough. With luck, we could see a general uplift of epistemic standards in both individual and collective cognition. And this is fair enough. People are getting, I think, a little better at abstract reasoning. We're getting a little more schooling, a little more universal schooling and literacy, so there's not nothing to this story. But then you say, you know, Bostrom, are you going to tell me that this alone in the next century, just normal progress of wisdom or sanity is expected to drive down risk by a factor of 1,000 or 10,000 despite rising technology? And Bostrom hasn't even made that claim. It's just very hard to see how one would pursue a claim like that without more detail. So Toby Ord goes for something much stronger. He goes for an appeal to civilizational virtue. So philosophers sometimes talk about virtue theory, and this is, I think, to be understood in the philosophical tradition of virtue theory. And he's going to ask that we treat humanity not as individuals. He thinks individuals aren't getting that much better, but rather as a collective. And he says even if we as individuals don't become more virtuous, the collective itself can become more virtuous just because groups can have properties that their individuals don't, right? ExxonMobil has billions of dollars even though none of its constituents own any of that money. So in particular, he's going to say that we're going to become wiser as a species by growing up and by acquiring some virtues. So he says we might get more patient, more self-disciplined, more prudent, more compassionate, better stewards of the land. We might become more grateful people, more fair people, more unified people. We might have more solidarity with one another. And as soon as we get this, we're going to have the wisdom to bring risk very, very low. And this is definitely a line you can push. I think this line's been hard for me because there are very few details from Ord about exactly what these virtues are and why we're going to achieve them. He certainly said we might, and in particular why we're going to achieve them in a strong enough way soon enough to shoot risk down very far. So I used to just end this point here. I said, well, Toby Ord owes us more. I think that's a little unfair, so I'm going to try to reconstruct maybe part of how the Ord story could go. I'm a bit uncomfortable with that. I kind of feel like people should give me their arguments and then I can respond to them, but I'll do my best to channel Ord with the caveat that, of course, it's hard to channel an argument that isn't written this way. So one thing you might be thinking about is unity. And Ord says, I think plausibly, look, how does humanity become more unified? Well, we make international organizations like the UN, or we sign treaties, weapons treaties, or trade treaties, and these help us to act a little bit more like a collective actor. This is, of course, good because if we're thinking of ourselves as a collective, there are more of us, so the value of safety just scales up with the size of the collective. Fair enough, but you ask what's the effect size? You say right now at least 2 countries have 15% of the population, and a lot of countries have at least 5% of the population. So in these countries, you're seeing at maximum, if we have full unity, a scaling up of like 6 or 7 times over the importance of preserving the future, because you've got 6 or 7 times more people coming from that actor in the future. Nothing to sneeze at, but we needed 10,000 or something, and that's not a 10,000, and then you say, okay, quite plausibly, I'll just keep piling on more virtues. It's a good idea. So Ord also says, look, people aren't getting any more patient. We're impatient now. We're going to be impatient in 20 years and 100 years and 200 years. People are going to undersave for retirement. They're going to want one cookie now instead of 2 cookies later. But humanity as a whole could become more patient. How do we do it? We could have futures assemblies. We could explicitly represent future people in deliberation. We could assign legal rights to future people, and that these things that we can do right now could help us to act more patiently. Certainly true. There's a great literature on how this happens. Tyler John and forgetting his co-author have a really good paper on long-termist institutional reform. But the worry is of what's the effect size. So if you read these papers on representing future people, they do make us a little bit more patient, but they don't make us thousands of times more patient. And you say, well, have we not just figured out the right intervention? But here I think I'm a little bit skeptical, right? Because if the story is that government or laws are going to force us to behave much, much more patiently than people want to, it's hard to see why a group of impatient people would put up with that kind of a government or that kind of a law unless the hypothesis is contra or that those people have also become more patient. So let's just sum up, and I think I have time for a lesson or two. So what did we do in this talk? We looked at 2 theses. Astronomical value thesis, it's astronomically valuable to do what we can to drive down risk. And existential risk pessimism, that risk is really high. And we saw first, I think, surprisingly, that these theses don't play well together. They actually play badly together. We said, okay, what can you do to get them both to be true together? And we said there's really one and only one good way to go here, which is the time of perils. And then I argued a bit, and I'm happy to talk more, that the time of perils hypothesis might not be true. So what would that imply, first theoretically and then more practically? So the first thing it implies is when you're calculating the value of mitigating existential risk, the background level of risk, 20% per century or 2% per century or 0.2% per century really matters. So I see all kinds of calculations that just don't mention the background level of risk R. And this is, I think, a crucial mistake because this parameter itself can shoot the value of existential risk mitigation up to the stratosphere, or it can shoot it below even your best short-termist intervention. There's also going to be, across models, even the time of perils model, there's going to be a tension between pessimism and astronomical value. Pessimism is bad for value. And this flips the dialectic in a way that I think people haven't appreciated. So often people think if you want to convince me that mitigating risk is very important, you have to tell me it's really high. And opponents have thought if you want to convince me that mitigating risk is very unimportant, you need to convince me it's low. But unless we say more, that's actually not true, right? If we just say this, that high risk means it's less important and low risk means it's more important, so the dialectic would be the other way around. And also the time of perils hypothesis emerges as a really crucial research question, right? If we lose the time of perils hypothesis, we might lose the compatibility between pessimism and astronomical value. Let's just skip to the last slides. So if you do want to check out the slides, I've got the slides uploaded. I've also got the full paper here. I've blogged about this paper, so I have a blog series. I put this on the EA forum as well, but I ran out of space to link. This is one of many working papers from the Global Priorities Institute. They're all on our website. I would encourage you to look at these as well as the paper summaries that we post of these papers. And we are going to put out a volume of, not this paper, but many of our papers soon, essays on long-termism. It's going to be open access. It'll be free. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about some of this kind of work, to take a look. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much, David. Questions will be through the swap card, and I will choose them. But in the meantime, while you're doing that, I have a question for you.
Yes.
The time of perils sort of time frame you listed was, I took it to be between sort of 50 and, was it 150 or 200 years, and the main countervailing consideration you gave to constant technological growth might be space exploration. Would anything change if the relevant countervailing factor was actually artificial general intelligence itself?
Yeah.
And the thought, okay.
Yeah, so there is an AGI story that'll work. So the AGI story can work in one of two ways. You can either say there's one and only one big risk and it's AGI, and after AGI goes well, there's no other big risks. That, I think, is not the story we get from someone like Ord. AGI is a big risk, but there are others. So the story has to be something like this. It has to be one, fast timelines, we're going to get AGI soon. And two, kind of traditional Bostromian version of superintelligence, that AGI, if it doesn't kill us, is going to be so incredibly intelligent that despite rapidly increasing dangers of a spacefaring and technological civilization, this AGI is going to be so powerful that it can single-handedly see our way through the dangers and quash them all. And I mean all of them, not most of them, not many of them, I mean almost all of them. And if you do have that kind of a story, that's definitely going to work. But you need both the fast timelines, and you need AGI is going to be so good, it's going to, as it were, stomp down almost all risk. There's a
have you told Elon his strategies wrong?
No. No, I haven't tried that. I don't know him personally. I'm not sure how he would react. I know he's on Twitter. I could try that.
That was the most voted of one. So.
No, I have not yet told Elon that I think his strategy is wrong.
Fair. Given AVT and X risk seem to be anti-correlated, why aren't critics of high X risk estimates also long-termists rather than the other way around?
Yeah. So this is really important, is this cuts both ways. So against effective altruists, telling me the risk is high is not a good idea unless you say something else. Against critics, telling me the risk is low is not a good idea unless you tell me something else. So you need to fold the dialectic a couple more steps. Like, I think one way you might go is tractability. You might say, well, if the risk is really high, then of course there's a cost-effective thing we can do to drive it down from 20%. But you say, oh, if the risk is really low, like 0.2 or 0.02%, then it's going to be much less tractable to drive it down. Or you might push on unmodeled costs of risk reduction. So, you ask Bostrom, what do you want to do about engineered pandemics and chemical weapons? How are you going to stop people from just synthesizing these in the garage? And he says, I know, lots of surveillance. And that is what you have to do if you want to push risk really, really, really low. Eventually, you have to be doing some pretty scary things to push the risk low. Also, of course, if you want to push AGI risk low, you might need to do something like just put the brakes on technology for a long time. And these are certainly, actions we could consider. But one thing this model didn't do was say, what we do to mitigate risk is going to drag down the value of the world, and potentially that could be a countervailing factor. But yeah, if you don't pull any of these moves, the critics are in as much trouble as the EAs here.
Could you not argue that while if we assume pessimistic estimates of X risk are true, value from reducing X risk is reduced, the expected value from reducing X risk for just 1 century is still higher than the expected value we could produce with many other interventions?
Yeah. So I think you should. I think anyone who tells you there's a one-shot argument against existential risk mitigation or a one-shot argument against long-termism has a very implausibly strong view. So where I'm trying to end up is in a place where numbers now matter. You can't just say whatever the probability mitigating existential risk is good. It might still be the best thing to do is to mitigate existential risk. It might not be. And I think that's right. So for example, detecting asteroids, the US Congress funded that. And these are very conservative people who don't believe generally that the mitigating existential risk is a good thing. So I want a model that explains why it's sometimes good to invest some money in mitigating existential risk, but I also want a model which explains why it's not always good to throw, say, 50% of our money into existential risk mitigation.
Just to follow on that slightly, is the thrust of your argument then you'd rather the philosophy almost bears less on the prioritization or
can
valuation?
I say that? I feel like I'm putting myself out of a job, but yes.
Okay.
At least tentatively, yes. I think I'm going to regret that, but at least tentatively, yes.
Surely 1 billion for, say, 160 times the value of a century is pretty great. Feels like catastrophic risk reduction is really cheap.
Yeah. So catastrophic risk reduction, I do not want to argue against. So we just lived through a pandemic, and we could have done a lot to prevent that. And if we prevented that, the economy would have been better, millions of people would have survived. Catastrophic risks are underfunded. We're potentially going to have another pandemic because we still haven't learned our lesson. So, whatever you think about existential risk, catastrophic risks do not have astronomical value to mitigate them. They are important. They are underfunded. EAs fund them. That is very good. But those are, I think, very much compatible with a view like this, where kind of catastrophic risk and existential risk are going to have not crazily different numbers. So catastrophic risk is going to look really good, and existential risk is going to be the one taking the hit.
I think that preempts some of the other questions offered as well on S-risk. But for the optimistic AGI story for Time of Perils, you said you need two assumptions. First, takeoff, and other risks become much more likely. What do you think of both assumptions?
Yeah.
Much less likely, sorry.
Actually make a request, and I'll make the request from a story. So I was in a work in progress group with two professors, full professors at Princeton, serious people. And someone brought up this objection. They said, look, the time of perils is going to end because AI is going to grow really smart really fast. Okay, there are arguments for that. But then they said there's also this second part of the objection, namely once AI gets very smart very fast, it's going to be able to see in the future and prevent all future risks. And they said, okay, that's really interesting. What's the paper making that argument? Because I'd like to read it and I'd like to cite it. And we said, there is no paper. And then they said, well, what's the blog post making that argument? And we said, there's no blog post. And then they said, what's the argument? And we were like, actually, we don't know. And so then they dropped it and they didn't go any further from it. So I think the request is like, this is a view. It's not yet a fully developed argument. It could be developed, but I think to get the argument off the ground, it really needs a serious write-up. So if you know of a serious write-up of this argument, let me know. And if you don't, I would hope someone would write it. So for example, this paper is conditionally accepted to a journal. It's going to, I think, go up, and it's not going to mention that argument. And the reason it doesn't mention that argument is because I need something to cite, and I don't have anything to cite. So potentially very good response. Please write it up.
Aren't you well within the EA mainstream in terms of your conclusions?
It depends how you define effective altruism, right? So if you like consequentialism, I like consequentialism. If you like evidence, I like evidence. If you like expected values, I like expected values. If you think future people matter, I think future people matter. If you have particular views about existential risk or about the time of perils, we disagree. There's like a very minimal way of defining effective altruism where everybody's an effective altruist. So if you say, what do? Effective altruism use reason and evidence to assess the world's priorities. Well, nobody's going to say they don't use reason and evidence to address the world's priorities. And if you say effective altruism is doing that in a consequentialist way, well, plenty of people are consequentialists. I think maybe a good way to think about me is imagine you had all the right philosophical views. You like consequentialism, you like totalism, you like future people, you like expected value, but you're a little skeptical of long-termism. What sorts of things might get you to get off the boat on long-termism?
Does space colonization have the same effect on S risks as it does on X risks?
Oh. Am I allowed to follow up? I really want to ask because I don't know that much about S risk. Can whoever asked that tell me what they mean? Because thank you.
I only meant it like very basic sense of like large-scale suffering risks.
Yeah. Do you have thoughts? I honestly don't have anything intelligent to say about how it might increase or decrease S risk, and I'm genuinely interested in hearing what you think about it. I don't have a good answer for you.
I then definitely don't have anything interesting to say.
Okay, but email me if you come up with something.
If I might weigh in possibly. A catastrophic risk would definitely constitute an S risk if it's high suffering. Maybe a different sense, which I think is in McCaskill's, is on stagnation. So the question is, would space colonization have the same effect on stagnation?
God, okay, I'm a little uncomfortable speculating about long-term future, and that's actually, I think, a major methodological difference that makes this hard for me. If I were to speculate, I would be fairly confident that going to space is going to reduce the risk of stagnation, because it's a lot harder. I'm generally uncomfortable speculating, but I think I am willing to go that far.
There seems to be a few more reasons to do impure discounting aside from the immutable X risk rate, e.g. diminishing returns to further utility that ultra-happy simulations have, clumsiness, i.e. we might be less able to influence the far future, etc. How do they factor in?
Oh, good. Yeah, so I black boxed value, right? If you look at all my models, and there's an Oxford grad student working on this too. I hope someone else will. I just call the value of a century V, right? And I say, take that for granted and do whatever. And then so you ask this question, V is determined by something like, population ethics, or within agents like your favorite theory of welfare, and how much better would a life have to be twice as good? Maybe, Elon Musk's life is only twice as good as mine, and then it gets really expensive. And yet, almost anything you do to unpack V would make this a lot more interesting and would be like a super important follow-up paper. So there's a philosopher of physics at Oxford right now writing a paper. He's going to open up V and he's going to put in population ethics. But if you instead ask questions about welfare, about artificial agents, like literally just open up that V and show me what you get. I don't know. I think that would be probably one of the most interesting directions in which to extend this model, and literally almost anything you do to that V should be worth doing.
That's all the questions on the chat.
There's a finger. Oh, got it.
I'm so terrified of the maths, so I'll challenge you on another question.
Sorry? Oh, thank you. So two things. One, I'm extending this. So I'm really hoping somebody else is going to extend this result for me. And in particular, the opening up V, I'm not going to do. I'm trying to think about, so if you think about the lesson of this paper, there's this one thing we do wrong in calculating risk, namely we forget the risk is repeated over centuries, and when you put that in, that matters. That's not the only thing that can go wrong in calculating existential risk. That's just one thing. So I'm working on a paper I call Mistakes in the Moral Mathematics of Existential Risk. It's just going to say what are some other things that we do wrong in calculating existential risk. I have a paper on the singularity hypothesis I'm working on, pushing back a little bit on the singularity. I have a paper on the scope of long-termism. And then I'm starting a faculty job at Vanderbilt in the fall. So I'll be, I think, still doing some GPR work, but maybe also opening up a little more of my work, which is bounded rationality.
Could you describe bounded rationality?
Yeah, okay, so here's something we sometimes forget. Humans have, we have bodies, and we know that. We also have minds, and these minds have limitations. There are things we can do and things we can't. They have certain speeds, certain costs, certain interactions. Put all of these things back in your favorite theory of rationality and then ask what happens to your favorite theory of rationality, and a lot of things change. So coherence might actually not always be the right thing to shoot for. People now have to use heuristics instead of expected utility maximizing. You get trade-offs between speed and accuracy, and speed and effort, and accuracy and effort, and coherence and accuracy, and almost anything you want, and normative theory gets different. So in bounded rationality, as a philosopher, I ask conceptual questions about what are the major changes to normative theory that happen when you go bounded, and what do we mean by some of the terms in the bounded rationality literature.
Are there any examples of things that are X risks but not GCRs? Otherwise, isn't there not much practical difference?
No, the other way. Yeah, so GCR, look, you can define it any way you would like. And I mean, Hilary Graves is working on a new definition of existential risk. I would think most people would assume that an X risk is just a GCR, but a lot worse. That I think if you had a definition of X risk that didn't automatically imply it was a global catastrophic risk, you'd probably have the wrong definition. I'd be open to a way of driving those apart. But I think most people want the implication to hold in that direction.
Where would you advise OpenPhil to give the next 1 billion on the margin? Long-termism or near-termism?
Gonna get me in trouble. You know the answer, near-termism.
Is that because of those cascading probabilities you dismissed earlier?
No, it has to be like 20 or 30 papers all like this one, because there's no silver bullet. If I tell you I got a silver bullet, you should just discount what I say right there. You know, you got 1 point here, that, you know, there's one way of pushing down the value of existential risk mitigation, and even if you got higher perils, it knocks a couple orders of magnitude off, and then you have to say something else, and something else, something else. I've got some other papers making some other objections. I need to write more, and hopefully there will be a book, and then hopefully I'll have almost enough evidence to say what I just said.
Which causes in near-termism?
Oh, that's real. I'm sorry, I don't want to. So I'll tell you a story. I went to Oxford for a year as an undergraduate, and I had a very excitable quant tutor. And there was one day we didn't have a tutorial. He'd been listening to a physicist who I won't name on the radio, and someone asked the physicist to prognosticate about AI or something that really wasn't in their wheelhouse, and the physicist did it. And he said, David, I want you to swear to me that you never do that. He said, David, I want you to swear to me that when someone asks you a question, you don't know the answer. I'll say, I'm sorry, I'm not qualified to do it. I promised. It's tempting. I'm not qualified, and I promised I won't answer.
Do you give money to charity, and if so, which charity?
I take the fifth.
20%, that's not bad.
No.
When you say you care about future people, do you mean you care about the quality of life of future people or the existence of future people?
Both.
And so if I could phrase, do you care about making future people happy?
I do not go in for an asymmetry in population ethics. Some people do, I do not.
There was an earlier question on the repugnant conclusion as well.
Oh, there's a paper that just came out, like 20 different population ethicists signed it, and it says something like this: repugnant conclusion is kind of bad, but almost everything in population ethics implies something bad. So it shouldn't be a starting point that vindicating the repugnant conclusion means your population ethics is wrong, which is not to say there's like nothing repugnant about the repugnant conclusion. Of course it's repugnant, but it can't just be an automatic objection to a theory that it gives you the repugnant conclusion.
Dr. David Thorstad, thank you very much.